It's time to get started. If you'll bow your head, we'll begin with prayer. Our holy and most awesome Father, we thank you that you are God most high, that you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that you are the God of us, the church, and that we get to belong to you, and we get to know you, and we get to follow you and learn about you. And Lord, we ask that we will live for you. You are such an incredible God. You are so busy in our lives. You make so many wonderful things happen for us. Many things which we're not even aware of, but even the things that we are aware of, we are so thankful. Lord, we ask that we don't take for granted just how much you take care of us and protect us and watch over us, and help us to see that even in David's life. When things seem to be at their worst, you are still there with him. You are still protecting him, and you are still taking care of him and providing for him. Help us, Lord, to always trust that you are providing for us. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. Go ahead and open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 17. We'll be finishing up that chapter and working our way down through chapter 20 this evening, finishing up the story, the tragic story of Absalom and the difficulty in the relationship that he had with his father, and trying to make sure that we understand, hopefully, some application from that story as we move along. I have misplaced my clicker, so Jody is going to be my clicker this evening, and I think I must, well, I guess I could use yours. I think I left it in my suit coat from Sundays, so have to, good thing I don't throw my coats in the wash, or it might be in the wash right now, you never know. So, pretty safe in the suit coat. So, all right, let's go ahead and do our, this is different than mine a little bit. All right, and talk about the story of Absalom and kind of finish up this story. Where did we leave it on Sunday? We know Absalom has been upset about what major incident? Okay, the raping of his sister Tamar by Amnon, his half-brother, also one of David's sons. And of course, did David punish Amnon the way he should have? No, and of course that, Absalom's very upset about that. He first takes his revenge out on Amnon, has Amnon killed by his servants, but then that doesn't seem to be enough. He escapes for several years. He comes back to Jerusalem for several years, and eventually he uses that time that he is in Jerusalem to create a following for himself, and ends up running David out of the city and basically seizes the city. One of the first things he does when he takes control of the city is what? What horrible event? Okay, so he lays with 10 of his father's concubines in the well, at least with the knowledge of the people, and he, after that, then takes the advice of Hushai and does not pursue David right away, as Ahithophel wanted him to do, and David is able to buy some time in order to prepare himself. Now, what's David's perspective in all of this? If you've read through these few chapters, how does David want all of this to work out? Do what? Yeah, I mean, and you actually don't read much about that, about it being God's will. David's really pursuing his own will. What's his own will? He what? Yeah, I mean, he wants Absalom spared through this whole thing. Now, and maybe that is God's will, maybe that, but that, I don't see a lot of that in the story. He does mention God, but there's not a lot of, not the same way we read early in the story where he inquired of the Lord again and again. Yes? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, that's the ways he mentions God is more in response to his own guilt. I did bad stuff, maybe it's God's will. Maybe that's why Shimei is yelling curses at me from the mountainside. Maybe all of this is happening because this is God's will. But in the case of the way he sees this whole battle turning out and everything, what he seems to want again and again is Absalom to be spared. Now, we have a tendency, I think, sometimes to be not very understanding of David in this situation, but put yourself in his shoes. Do you want your son killed? I mean, as much as we have probably picked on David a little bit to say he has not been a very kingly, justice-focused father, he didn't kill Amnon, he didn't kill Absalom, which is what he should have done back when he brought Absalom back. What's been the consistent pattern with David and his family? Well, and we pick on him for that, and I think rightly so. I'm not saying that's a wrong perspective, but the consistent thing you see with David is that he wants his family to be safe and protected, right? I mean, if we're trying to maybe spin this a little more positively than we normally spin it, what father is there among us that's like, yeah, I hope my son gets what's coming to him? I hope he dies. He needs the death penalty. I mean, are any of us rushing to that as our go-to conclusion? Even if our child deserves it, how many of us have ever known our child deserves one thing but really desired something more positive for them? Right? I mean, I think that's human nature. That's fatherly nature. The thing that you see consistently with David is that he doesn't want Amnon punished. He doesn't want Absalom punished. He doesn't want Absalom to die, even though Absalom has rejected him and stolen his throne. He's putting his compassion as a father ahead of his duty as a king. Okay, maybe I'm being too generous. I don't know. I struggle with this a little bit. Dallas? Yeah. Except Herods tend to kill their children. That's just different. That's we'll get to that in the New Testament. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There is that should I, as a preacher, put my job as a preacher ahead of my job as a father? Would any of you think that I should? Okay. Should David put his job as king ahead of his job as a father? Now, again, I think we recognize part of the problem is that he hasn't been doing his job as a father because his children aren't very righteous. Granted, I get that. I understand. I agree. But I do think there is a battle going on inside of David through all of this. That's kind of just expected, and we should read that into it. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about that a little bit in here a few classes ago. The idea of, Samuel had unrighteous children, Eli had unrighteous children. You even go back through Genesis. Isaac is not nearly the standard of faith that Abraham is. Jacob is a good bit of a scoundrel for most of his life. I mean, you have each generation getting worse than the generation before it. You're going to see that as we get into the divided kingdom. Where just every now and then you get these returns to righteousness, but they're surprising because of what, just how unrighteous things had gotten before them, because just generation after generation gets worse. You see the same thing here with David, and that doesn't surprise us. But I'm also trying to give David the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if I'm king, I don't know that. Well, I don't have to be king. I don't know that my children can do anything that would cause me to not love my children and want to wish them harm. You would mourn over them. That doesn't mean you wouldn't pursue righteousness in their case. If they were to walk away from the Lord, that would make the relationship very strained and difficult, right? I think we would all agree with that. But it is, I don't think any of us wish them harm. Kill them. They have it coming, right? I mean, none of it, that's not our go-to response. So I don't know that I don't know about you. I don't know that I am always fair with David, looking at this from an outsider's perspective on what he should have done versus the way he feels. I can look at this with no emotional attachment whatsoever. David can't. This is still his son. And so that makes it, I think, a little more difficult. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Saul wants to kill his son. Yeah, so there's, maybe there are those occasional fathers that don't win Father of the Year for sure. So Saul would be one of them. So, Absalom has taken the throne. He sets up Amasa over his army. Amasa essentially becomes into the same role that Joab has played for David. Joab is what? General, right? Like he's commander of the whole army. It seems that Absalom has set Amasa up in the same role for him. He is Joab's counterpart in this war that's going to take place. And David has gone out to Mahanaim. These names kill me. And there's a guy named Shobi who comes and brings him supplies, brings him food, brings him things. Why do you think that story's in there? That there's this man who comes to where David is camped out and brings him all these supplies. What does that tell us? Okay, so I think there's definitely the sense in which God is still providing for David even in the darkest moments. Okay, God always has provided for David, and David has had a lot of dark moments in the stories that we have about him, right? And God is always taking care of him. What else does it tell us? Say it again? Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's there to reveal to us that David has not been rejected by the nation. He's been rejected by a small segment of the nation. And I don't know, again, that they've rejected David as much as they've just chosen Absalom over him. Well, Absalom's the next generation. He's the king's son. This is a natural exchange of power, but there's still a lot of people who are very loyal to David. Even in distress, these people are going to come to David's aid. And I think partly that is God showing his ability to provide, but I think it's also the people. Now, even when all of this is over, we're going to find that the civil unrest between people, there's the men of the north and the men of the south, right? And some are loyal to David and some are not loyal to David, and there's going to be that division. Nancy? Yep, sorry, thought I saw your hand pop up. All right, so David gets out there, he organizes his troops and kind of pieces them all together. He gets out there, he kind of figures out how much he's got, how many people are there, he divides them up. He puts, I think in 3 different segments. So he divides them up. Joab has some, I think it's Abiathar has some, and then the Gittite, let me make sure I find that right. Ittai, or I'm doing this off of memory. sure I'm even looking at the right chapter here. Nope. Nope. Oh, right there at the end. I'm looking at the beginning of chapter 17. I'm like, this is not it. All right, so you've got all these people. David comes to Mahanaim. Shobi brings all of this supplies: wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honey, curd, sheep, goat, cheese, and all these things. He reviews his troops there at the beginning of chapter 18, and he divides them up to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. And those three kind of become the generals, the army leaders, and they're going to go out. Now, what's David also want to do? Go with them. You think David's learned his lesson? You know, I look at that and I go, yay, David, had you done that in the first place, we wouldn't have all of this mess. Like, you know, a lot of this mess came from the fact of when he didn't go to war. But what do his people say? Please don't. Okay, why? Yeah, I mean, if you go, all they're after is your head. So you're worth 10,000 of us. I mean, that you have to stay safe. We can go out and fight, and they're not going to just center in on one of us. You stay here. And so he says, I'll do whatever you think is best. But then we get there to verse 4. I will do what you think is best, the king replied. He stood beside the city gate while all the troops marched out by hundreds and thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, treat the young man Absalom gently for my sake. You know, if I'm Joab, I'm either rolling my eyes right now or I'm sighing going, still? Like, king, come on. This is not, you know, and that, I feel safe saying that's what Joab's response was, because a little bit later on, that's exactly what his response is when somebody reminds him of this command. This is not his, what Joab knows needs to happen. And again, this is one of those Joabs like us. He can look at this somewhat removed. He's not emotionally attached to Absalom unless the emotions are negative, and he's ready for Absalom to be out of the picture. He knows Absalom has made bad decision after bad decision and just needs to be stopped, and David's still trying to protect him. Okay, and that's not good. So the battle happens. Absalom's army comes. David's army comes. Who wins? How handily? Yeah. So reminds me of a scene from Lord of the Rings. But so I don't know that the trees really came to life and started attacking people. But David's forces marched into the field to engage Israel in battle, which took place in the forest of Ephraim. Israel's army was defeated by David's soldier, and the slaughter there was vast that day, 20,000 dead. So slaughter was great, massive. It was an incredible victory. There was no doubt in anyone's mind which army was victorious here. And I think that's the point. There's nobody who's going to be able to argue, well, God was with Absalom that day, right? I mean, this was absolutely 100% a decisive victory on David's behalf, and it showed that God was with David. And that's important. That's important for the people to see. During this story, you've got this famous story here of Absalom. He's riding his mule when he happened to meet David's soldiers. It doesn't say he's fleeing. It doesn't. As far as I can tell, he's just riding his mule and takes a bad turn, as far as we can tell. But he gets caught up in the tangled branches of the large oak tree, and his head was caught fast. I don't know if there's a corresponding passage. I've always been taught that the way he got caught was what? his hair. It doesn't say that here. Even today, Janie and I were looking over, she reads the story out of a Bible story book, and then she also reads the story out of her Bible to prep herself for Sunday and Wednesday night Bible class. And of course, in the Bible story book, it had a picture, and Absalom is caught by the neck in the tree, not by the hair. And she's like, that's not the way this happens. He gets caught by his hair, right? Well, that's not really what it says. And so that in and of itself, I don't know how he got caught. I don't know if it was a combination of that. He got stuck, though. Stuck to the point to where he wasn't able to get down. One of the reasons I always wondered this is because I always thought, how vain do you have to be to not just cut your hair? I mean, you've got a sword. I'm sure he has a knife. He could have just sliced through his hair and got away, right? Like that's just logical sense, unless you're just that concerned about your flowing locks. But somehow he gets stuck. He is stuck in this tree, not able to get out of this tree, and so he ends up being, I would assume, just surrounded, and there's nothing he can do. Yes?
The arrow that went in and lodged in Ahab's. Is this kind of like what you're doing here?
I don't think so.
My point is that God has ordained that Absalom would be defeated and that Absalom would be killed and that revolution would be.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
I'm more explaining it from the fact of we're taught certain details that aren't necessarily true, and we need to separate. The way I picture this personally is that Absalom gets caught up in this tree and somehow is stuck and is immediately surrounded and therefore really has nowhere to go. And so he is surrounded well enough or stuck well enough that they're able to take a message back to Joab and say, we've got him. And Joab says, well, then kill him. And of course, the servant says, what? I'm not killing him. We all heard David say, treat him gently. And Joab basically says, well, then get out of my way. And he went and he takes 3 spears and he stabs Absalom through. And then it says that Joab's servant or his bodyguards, his armor bearers, go and attack Absalom and kill him. So you've kind of got a long, seemingly painful killing process here for a man who's stuck in a tree. And when all that is over, Joab sounds his trumpet, which it doesn't say what the trumpet was for. My assumption is we've caught him, the war is over, we're done. And he basically, the word is brought back to David as to what happened. It is also interesting to me in here, when you look at the way the message is delivered to David, how does David receive the message? Before we get to him even finding out, somebody comes to Joab. Who goes to Joab? Ahimaaz goes to Joab and says, hey, let me take the message, right? And Joab's first response is, no, there's no point. And he persists in wanting to deliver this message to David. And so Joab basically says, well, fine, you can, I've already sent a messenger, but you can go. And apparently the guy is just a really fast runner, and he's able to outrun the other guy and get to David and share the message. It just reminds me of the similar story whenever news of Saul's death came to David. Y'all remember that? And there's that sense of, well, I want to go deliver the message. I want to go give the good news, because all of these people expect David to be happy when his enemies are vanquished. And how does it normally happen with David? He's not happy. Yeah, he's not celebrating with everybody else. And so David here mourns for his son because he is very upset that his son, and so you see there verse 33 of chapter 18, the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber above the city gate and wept. As he walked, he cried, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. So just an anguished cry of grief. David is distraught. And I kind of wonder if it's not just about Absalom. I mean, you got to remember, has he had a great relationship with Absalom? I mean, not for years, at least. We don't know what their relationship was like before the incident with Tamar, but since the incident with Tamar, and that has been at least 7 years, okay, he has not had anything to do with Absalom. Absalom ran away for 3 years to his grandfather's house in another country, and then Absalom came back and for 2 years never even spoke to David, right? And then possibly, depending on what your version says, another 4 years in which Absalom is stirring up and creating support for himself. So we've got up to possibly 11 years since he's really had a relationship with David. Okay, I wonder if this isn't a general grief of David for all of the failures. That David, every time one of these big bad things happens to David, what do you think he accounts it back to? His sin. David has not, I don't think, forgiven himself for what God has forgiven him for. That David recognizes that Amnon and the loss of Amnon, the loss of Absalom, the loss of the child that he had, that Bathsheba was pregnant with from the beginning. I mean, just how many family tragedies is David going to see happen, all because he had a night of weakness, right? Or maybe even a longer weakness, we don't know, but the one we know about is the night with Bathsheba. That I'm not saying he had other affairs. I'm saying you generally don't go from being completely pure-minded to having an affair overnight. Like, there's generally something that leads up to that. And so, when you look at all of that and you see the way David responds here, I think there's just a general sense of overwhelming grief regarding his sin in general. That Absalom died because of me. Amnon died because of me. The first unnamed child died because of me. And there's just that grief that goes along with that. Okay? All that makes sense? Now again, it could just be he's really upset about Absalom. You know, I'm reading those extra pieces in there based more off of human nature, not as much off of what is actually revealed in the text. But you do see him mourning, and mourning to what degree? Is he privately mourning in a closet? No. What do we find out? Yeah, I mean, everybody knows David is distraught. This is not a private mourning. He mourns his son very publicly to the point to where Joab gets upset. Joab basically says, you've turned our victory. You know, all of these people have followed you. They have been loyal to you. They have, even when you are rejected as king and thrown out of the capital city, these people stayed with you. Many of these people have been with him since before he was king. Okay, remember, where did 600 of these people come from? From Philistia, from Gath, where he was before he became king. So these are people who have been with him through thick and thin for a long time, many of them. And Joab says, and you're mourning the upstart, the rebel, the rogue who came and stole your throne? That's where you're putting your heart? He rebukes him big time. And again, this goes back to, how has Joab's feelings towards David changed? Have they changed? Do what? Yeah. I mean, Joab has made multiple statements at this point in rebuke to David because of the way David has not behaved the way Joab knows he should be behaving. Remember back when, after the episode of Bathsheba, and Joab says, you need to get out here, we're about to take this city. If you don't get out here and do your job, I'm going to name the city after me. I mean, that was a bold and rebellious thing for Joab to propose. And now Joab's rebuking the king because the king has his heart in the wrong place. And again, Joab's not wrong, is he? Now, I think he's probably out of place, being that he's speaking to his king this way. Maybe they have a deeper relationship than king and commander, and there's a friendship there in which they can have these kind of conversations. I would assume that's true. But, I mean, here, Joab basically sets David straight. And I see Joab as another one of those provisions from God. How many times has David been thankful for a person God has put in his life to set him straight, to keep him from sinning, to keep him from messing up? And I think Joab's another one of those. Joab has his own faults and his own problems, and he likes to take revenge on people. He has. But you do see here him very much being that voice of reason for David that David needed at the moment. And I think God provided that. And then you've got David returning home, and there's several people that are involved. There's individual stories here, like Shimei. Okay, Shimei, we know he did what when David was being thrown out of the city? Hurled abuse and insults, right? Kind of followed along on the other ridge, yelling as David and these people went away, to the point to where they wanted to kill him. Like, he apparently was so good at trash talking that people wanted to kill him. Reminds me, we used to do basketball games at FC, and there was a friend of mine who I refused to sit near during a basketball game because he was so loud and so obnoxious that referees would throw him out of the gym. Like, he was that good at trash talking the other team, and the referees would actually make him leave. Okay, not ugly. He never said bad things. He just was that loud and obnoxious and disturbing. That's how I picture Shimei. He's my good friend from college. And I mean that. But he comes to David and basically does what? Grovels. Okay. Well, you know, I know I said all those things, but don't kill me. I mean, that's essentially, yeah. I mean, and so he tries to make things good again because, I mean, do you think he expected David to win? No. And again, while we're not told a lot about what he said, David's impression from what he said was that God sent him as a messenger, as a burden for David as punishment. I kind of wonder if Shimei didn't see himself that way. And now, you know, he expected this to go exactly the way he had envisioned God's will happening, and of course that doesn't happen. Then you got Mephibosheth, who, according to Ziba, stayed in the city because he was expecting to get some of his rightful authority and possessions back, in that the house of Saul was going to be restored. And he comes and grovels. And basically what he says is what? Why did he stay? Do what? Yeah, I mean, he basically turns the tables on Ziba and says that, you know, I wasn't really doing a bad thing. Where's this? 20, say it again. There it is. My servant Ziba betrayed me. Actually, your servant said, I'll saddle the donkey for myself so I can go ride with the king, for your servant's lame. And Ziba slandered your servant to my lord the king. My personal opinion is that he's making this part up. In my head, Mephibosheth is the bad guy. Other people disagree with me on that. We're never really told in the story who was being honest and who wasn't. But I think personally Mephibosheth is groveling the same way Shimei is groveling. And of course, David, not having an answer, does what? Just split it up. Ziba can have half, you can have half. That's plenty for both of you, which ends up actually being still a blessing for Ziba and a punishment for Mephibosheth, doesn't it? Which is again one reason that I think Mephibosheth is lying, but David has made promises to Jonathan to protect Jonathan's family, and this is a way he can both punish Mephibosheth and still keep his promise to Jonathan. That's my own personal take on Mephibosheth's story. Then there's Barzillai. He is blessed because here he is. He had come down. He had tried to do good things for the king, and he's old. And David basically wants him to come home with him. And he says, I'm too old for that. I'm going to die soon. Let me stay near my father's tomb so I can, die. But here, take your servant Shimham. And basically that's what David does and blesses Shimham as a blessing to Barzillai. And then there's a dispute that follows after that between the men of Judah and the men of Israel. Basically, there's just an argument as to who's more loyal. The men of Judah say they're more loyal. They've got this connection to the king. He's more like family to us. And of course, the men of Israel said, we're loyal to, that's going on. But we do have a follow-up story real quick to cover, which is there in chapter 20, which is the revolt of Sheba. There apparently, even though we do see glimpses that there are plenty of people still loyal to David, are there still people who aren't loyal to David? Yes, and Sheba is the example of that. He's a wicked man, Benjamite, and basically he goes around saying that we have no place with David, and so all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba. So that solves the whole Israel-Judah debate, right? They immediately desert David as soon as they can. And Sheba basically is the leader of that. Well, David sends Joab in pursuit. Joab goes and he kills Amasa. Who was Amasa? There's a lot of names in this story. So, all right, so he was Absalom's Joab. He was Absalom's commander, the leader of the army. And so Joab goes and he kills Amasa as a part of this whole conflict that he has with Sheba. And then he goes and he seizes a city where Sheba's hiding. And instead of just attacking Sheba, he attacks the whole city and puts it under siege. And of course, bad things are happening, as always do whenever a city is under siege. And they send out a wise woman. It's amazing how often women play a role in David's life. Have you ever noticed this? Not just, like the Bathsheba role. Obviously, that was a bad thing that happened in David's life. But how often it is that a woman comes to David with wisdom or with answers. Remember the last time? That was another one of those times when David was needing answers and a wise woman came and confronted him. Now you've got the same thing of, this isn't David, but it's Joab, but it's in the David story where there's a wise woman who comes out and basically speaks for the city, right? And what does she say? Yeah. Well, why are you here? What are you doing? Well, we're here to get Sheba. Well, why are you attacking the whole city? Well, because we need Sheba. Well, how about we just bring you Sheba? We'll just cut off his head and throw it over the city wall. Do that, sure. So they do. They cut off his head and they throw it over the city wall. And Joab's true to his word. I mean, they throw the head over the city walls, and Joab leaves the city alone and goes back to David. And so after that, you just kind of have a couple little details that show us that things were put back in place. Now, all of these are stories that we're probably a little less familiar with. They're not the go-to children's Bible story book stories that you typically read. These aren't the ones you tell your kids when you're laying them down at night. You know, the evil man who had his head cut off and thrown over the city wall. That's just typically I don't have my children illustrate that story. I mean, these are not the go-to stories. Why do you think we have them in such detail then? I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of stories that could have been told about David, right? That probably weren't. And so one question you should always ask yourself, you won't always come up with an answer. So I will say that from the beginning. But one of the good questions you can ask yourself as you sit down and you study the Bible is, why this story? I mean, there are plenty of other stories that could have been told. Why this story? Why these stories that you have here? Absalom's easy to understand. It was a pretty major event. But couldn't we have just said, well, David was restored to his throne and he went back home? Right? Isn't that a nice little bow on the end of the story? Yeah. Okay. 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 Does he ever get his power reconsolidated? Yeah. Yeah. But is it easy? No. And what happens pretty soon after Solomon? Things start falling apart again, right? So the reason I point this out is because David's reign as king is it's the golden age. It's even among Jews, they'll talk about having the throne of David restored or the kingdom of David restored. They talk about that in the New Testament. That was the king that you go back and look at. It was that reign that was really important. But how very peaceful was that reign? Weren't there a lot of bad things that happened during that reign? And as we've noted already, when did most of those bad things start happening? When sin entered the picture. And I think that's important for us to recognize that one of the things that is interesting to me in this story is that, going back and using the story of Bathsheba as the hinge in David's reign and his life, up until the hinge, how hard was it for David to have peace and things to go good? It seemed to just go well. Like just victory on every side. Everything was blessed. The country was growing. The borders were being secured. Riches were abundant. Houses and palaces were being built. It was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. You hit that sin, and now how easy is peace? Really difficult. Dallas? Yep. Yep. And it will happen even after his deathbed. And that's what's interesting to me in this whole thing, is that David's story is a powerful lesson on the consequences of sin. Okay, I don't know that all of these events happen because God caused them to happen. I tend to think more that these incidents happen because sin opened the door for these things to happen. Many of the consequences happen not because you see God bringing in an oppressing nation, which is what you read of a lot of times back in like Judges or later on. The reason you see a lot of these things happen, all this stuff with Absalom, it didn't happen because God caused Absalom to be an obstinate and rebellious son. Why did it happen? As far as we can tell, it's because David wasn't able to recover from his sin to act like a just king and father the way he should have, and he let his own guilt interfere with his ability to provide justice. We talked about that, I think, last class or the class before. That had David, I think, not been dealing with the same issue of rape, and maybe whether we want to qualify what happened with him and Bathsheba as rape or not, I think that his incident with Bathsheba absolutely colored his ability to provide justice in the case of Tamar, because there are so many parallels there. Well, I can't punish him for something I did, right? I mean, that sort of thing. Had he provided justice in that case, I don't think all of this with Absalom would have happened. But all of it happened because now he's not willing to punish his son, and now he's not willing to punish his other son, and now his other son has died, and people are seeing all the fractures in the reign of David and the sin he's allowed in and the guilt he's allowed to influence things. All of those are just consequences of sin. I don't know that a lot of the punishment that we read of from Nathan as he prophesied what would happen to David were direct punishments as much as they were, these are the things you can expect to happen because of your sin. David's story is a great story to look at when we want to see just how bad things can go when we decide to walk away from God's way of doing things. Sin has consequences, major, long-lasting, repetitive consequences, if we're not willing to truly turn to God and be forgiven and forgive ourselves. And that's one reason I love in the New Testament the great emphasis on grace and forgiveness. You don't see that in the Old Testament the way we have in the New Testament. It is one way in which our covenant is far superior. We won't have these same struggles that David had. So anyway, I'm out of time. Thank you for your attention.